Welcome, Clyde, to the pelvic floor. I feel perfectly worthless without a piece of chalk and a chalkboard. Normally, I do this in the lab, and I enjoy drawing these structures. And I also need faces to look at, and occasionally I like to hear a chuckle. Well, circumstances as they are, I will have to do the best I can without that. These are the muscles of the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor is also called the perineum. The external genitalia are structures of the perineum along with these muscles. So what you see here are things that my mama told me not to show students, but I don't know how I can teach this area of the anatomy without showing you these things. So do me a favor and just don't tell my mama that I did it. Go to the next slide and we will look at these in greater detail and with labels. Ah, yes. Now, when the skin has been removed and the underlying fascia has been removed from this area of the body, these are the muscles that come into view, and also the skeletal landmarks that you have there. Those are the two pubic bones, the two ischia, and the coccyx. Surrounding the penis in the male and surrounding the vagina in the female, that muscle is the bulbospongiosus. Arising from the ischium and supporting the penis in the male, supporting the clitoris in the female, that is the ischiocavernosus. Now, I know I'm throwing out words here that my mama told me I shouldn't go around saying. So don't y'all tell her that I said those words. The most superficial of all of these muscles that lies directly under the skin is the superficial transverse perineal muscle. There will also be a deep transverse perineal, which we will see on the next slide. By the way, there is a line here, the first line shown there. It doesn't have a label that goes with it. It's pointing to that little white band of connective tissue there in the bulbospongiosus. That is called the perineal raphe or perineal raphe, R-A-P-H-E. It's just connective tissue that connects the right side to the left side. We have then the external anal sphincter, which is skeletal muscle under voluntary control. If there is an external anal sphincter, would there not also be an internal anal sphincter? Well, of course there is. Well, it is under involuntary control. We have then the four muscles that together are called the levator ani, and we will detail those four on the next slide. Next. Okay, looking at these two illustrations, I see several mistakes, and I decided to use the illustrations anyway because sometimes pointing out errors is a good teaching tool. First of all, the image on the left is labeled third layer perineum. That is not the third layer, that is the second layer. The image on the right is labeled second layer perineum. That is not the second layer, that's the third layer. How do I know? Well, in the second layer, we would see the superficial transverse perineal muscle. Notice that that is shown. It is not labeled, but you can see it in the image on the left. The superficial transverse perineal runs left and right of the perineal body. It is just under the skin, so it is the most superficial of all the muscles. So it would be correctly placed in the second layer. So the image that is on the left is actually the second layer. The image that is on the right is the third layer. Okay, back to the image on the left, which I have already cleared up. That is the second layer. Start at the pubic symphysis. The clitoris is properly located. The urethral meatus is properly located. The vagina is properly labeled. The muscle that surrounds the vagina is the bulbospongiosus. That's correct. The muscle that supports the clitoris is the ischiocavernosus. That is correct. At this level, we can see the deep transverse perineal muscle, which runs deep to the superficial transverse perineal, which is not labeled, but it is shown in the image on the left. You can find it. It looks like a bow tie. The external anal sphincter is not labeled, but you can see it there surrounding the anus. Then we have those muscles that as a group are called the levator ani, raises the butthole. Okay, let's see, running from the pubic bone to the rectum, that is correctly labeled puborectalis. Running from the pubic bone to the coccyx, that is correctly labeled, that is pubococcygeus. Running from the ilium to the coccyx, that also is correctly labeled, that is the iliococcygeus. Usually, the coccygeus muscle is also included in the group called levator ani. So that is why I say there are 4 muscles to the levator ani, and they are all shown here, and they are correctly labeled. If you will look real closely, just to the right and left of the coccyx, you see another muscle there. Well, that's your old friend, the piriformis, the lateral rotator that we talked about previously. Okay, go to the image on the right, and this one is rich with mistakes. So let's go through it, and I will identify the errors and see if you can learn anything just by me pointing out things that are wrong. The pubic symphysis is properly labeled. There is a line drawn, but no label is written just under the pubic symphysis. That would be the clitoris. Just south of that, the line drawn saying vagina, I don't think so. That is the urethral orifice. The line drawn from the words perineal body, I don't think so. That's the vagina. The perineal body is where the 2 superficial transverse perineal muscles come together at the midline. So that would be just south of the vagina. It is not labeled. There's no line drawn to it. So what they're calling there the perineal body, that's the vagina. What they're calling the vagina, that's the urethral meatus. What there is no word given for, but a black line drawn, that would be the clitoris. Okay, on the left, we have listed the muscles of the levator ani. Okay, if it's puborectalis, then it runs from the pubic bone to the rectum. What they are pointing to is not it. Okay, so let's get these straight. On the left, the muscles listed as levator ani. The first one shown there, pubococcygeus, running from the pubic bone to the coccyx. Fine. The muscle labeled puborectalis, that is not going to the rectum, Clyde. Look at the muscle. It's going to the coccyx. That muscle is the iliococcygeus. The next one listed there, iliococcygeus, that is the coccygeus muscle. So they have the lines drawn to the wrong muscles there. Pubococcygeus is correct. Puborectalis is actually iliococcygeus. and iliococcygeus is actually coccygeus. You have to look going right to the rectum in order to see the puborectalis. They don't have it correctly labeled and they don't have a line drawn to it at all. Okay, the big muscle that you see there running left and right of the coccyx, that is the gluteus maximus. We would see deep to the gluteus maximus, the piriformis, which we saw on the other image. Next slide. Okay, I think if you click once, you'll see the image. If you click again, you'll see the lines that go to the individual muscles. See if you can identify these looking at them from the top down. So effectively what you would be looking at is the third layer. So you should be able to recognize these. If you click again and again and again, it will bring up the actual names of the muscles so you can check yourself and see how you're doing. Okay, this is the original image shown on the front page. In this case, all you have to do is click to bring up the image, click again to bring up the lines. See if you can identify what is there without the labels coming up, and then test yourself. Click again, and the labels will come up and see how you did. That'll be all, folks. Well, after you have learned all of the muscles of the upper extremities, you can show this photograph to little sister and point to and name all of these muscles on Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger. This appears to be maybe 1972, 73, about the time that Arnold came to America from his native Austria. I remember those days, and I remember seeing photographs like this of him. People had never seen a person quite this muscular. Well, it turns out that Arnold had cheated just a little bit using a variety of hormones and other performance enhancing drugs. Well, we would call it cheating today, but back then there were no rules or regulations about use of substances like that. So Arnold took full advantage. Well, I guess it worked out okay for him. He became a movie star and then later became governor of California. So I guess for some people, breaking the rules works out okay. Okay, all the same, what we have is way more than the time will allow for you to get all of this down. The musculature of the arms and hands is very complex. All the same, we can take it on and hopefully accomplish something. Those of you who are going to go on to study occupational therapy, physical therapy, physician's assistant, or go to medical school. I can promise you, you will have to know all of this well enough to write your own book about it. So put your time in and do the best you can to learn as much as you can. I know that this is not ideal. Normally we would be in the laboratory learning these things, but this is what we have. So this is what we will go with. Okay, let's get started on the next slide. Okay, as you can see, what we have here are the anterior muscles that act upon the upper arm. Our deltoideus, that is the primary abductor of the upper arm. It is innervated by a branch of the brachial plexus. The nerve is called the axillary nerve. Here we have the pectoralis major, that is the primary adductor of the upper arm. It brings the arm toward the midline. The pectoralis major receives dual innervation from the medial and lateral pectoral nerves. The biceps brachii is shown here, but it has two heads. You would need to know that. That's what biceps means, two heads. It has a long head and a short head. For the biceps brachii, long is lateral. So the long head is the lateral aspect of it. The short head is the medial aspect of it. Deep to the biceps brachii is the brachialis muscle. Both of these are flexors of the lower arm. Not labeled here, I can see it, but it doesn't have a line going to it. Just medial to the brachialis, they're actually situated between the biceps brachii and the brachialis. That is the coracobrachialis muscle. You should also recognize there on the ribs the serratus anterior. The brachioradialis acts on the lower arm, so we will talk about that on another slide. Well, most of this should be review because when we took up the muscles of the back, we talked about most of these. But since many of them insert on the arm and therefore move the arm, we'll cover them again. On the left side, you can see in the supraspinous fossa, the supraspinatus. In the infraspinous fossa, the infraspinatus, the lovely deltoideus, and then we have labeled the teres major, but as you know, the teres minor is situated over the teres major, which that will be shown on the right side. Then we have the big duopodae originating on the spinous processes of the vertebrae, also originating on the iliac crest, inserting at the surgical neck of the humerus, the latissimus dorsi. On the right side, we have a little deeper look and a little more detailed look, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, teres major. The supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor insert on the head of the humerus. Therefore, they are 3 of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. The teres major inserts at the surgical neck of the humerus, so it is not a rotator. Shown here are 2 of the 3 heads of the triceps brachii. Triceps means 3 heads. Well, we're showing 2 of them here. Notice that we have a lateral head and we have a long head. The way I remember this is that for the triceps, lateral is lateral. It was not that way for the biceps. For the biceps, we have a long and a short head. And so we said that for the biceps, long is lateral. For the triceps, lateral is lateral. Okay, so we have then the lateral head of the triceps. We have the long head. Well, there are 3 heads, not shown here. Down close to the elbow on the medial aspect, we would also have the medial head of the triceps brachii. Why it was not shown in this illustration, I don't know, but it's there certainly are 3 heads to the triceps brachii. Next. I think this is a good illustration here. I actually like this one. It shows most of the muscles that I would expect you to know, superficial muscles of the upper and lower arm. Starting there at the coracoid process of the scapula. Remember, I told you that we do have situated between the biceps brachii and the brachialis, the coracobrachialis muscle, which is shown there and properly labeled. Also, I told you that the biceps has 2 heads. The 2 heads are shown here. And I think I made a point of telling you that for the biceps, long is lateral. So it is shown there appropriately. Also, I told you that there were 3 heads to the triceps brachii. And down near the elbow on the medial aspect, you would find a medial head of the triceps brachii. So it is shown there and it is properly identified. The brachialis muscle is situated deep to the biceps and it is properly labeled there. Going down south of the elbow, we have the pronator teres. To pronate means to turn face down. So this muscle contracts to turn the forearm, the wrist, and the hand palm side down. Now, the flexor muscles of the forearm, on the anterior aspect of the forearm, these are the superficial muscles. There are layers of deep muscles to these. I like to start on the lateral side and come across. That's the way I memorized these muscles when I was a student, and I still do it that way. So whether we be on the anterior aspect, which is what is shown here, or the posterior aspect, the lateral most muscle that you would see is the brachioradialis. So that's where I always like to start. So whether I'm looking at the front side or the back side, I go to the lateral most muscle I can find, and I say, well, that's the brachioradialis, and then I just memorize what comes up after that. So these are laid out appropriately. Start at brachioradialis, then you have flexor carpi radialis, then you have palmaris longus, then you have flexor carpi ulnaris. Those are the primary flexors of the wrist. They insert on the wrist bones and they flex the wrist. Now, deep to that, we have the muscles that will flex the fingers. The flexor digitorum superficialis, well, that only means there must be a flexor digitorum profundus. Flexor digitorum superficialis is superficial to the flexor digitorum profundus. Also, deep to that, we have the pronator quadratus. Remember, pronators turn things face down. So this would be to turn the wrist and the hand face down. There is a band of connective tissue that wraps around the wrist. On the flexor side, it's called the flexor retinaculum. On the dorsal aspect of the arm, it's called the extensor retinaculum. To most folks, it is simply called the carpal tunnel. Notice how the tendons of these muscles that go into the hand have to pass through that tunnel. Well, later I will show you some nerves that also pass through that tunnel. Since tendons are attached to muscles and muscles contract, things move. Where you have movement, you have friction. Where you have friction, you might well have irritation and inflammation. Well, if you have inflammation, things are going to swell. Didn't I say nerves pass through that tunnel? Well, if it starts to swell there, the swelling can compress those nerves, and you have carpal tunnel syndrome. All right, Clyde, what you're looking at here are the extensor muscles of the wrist and fingers located in the posterior aspect of the forearm. You are looking at the back side of the hand, the back side of the forearm. What I said on the previous slide is what I will employ here also. I find the lateral most muscle. I know that that is the brachioradialis. I start at the brachioradialis and I march across the thing, memorizing the muscles that I come to as I go. Remember, the thumb is lateral, so the thumb is situated to your right there. So on the lateral aspect, I find the most lateral muscle we have, the brachioradialis. The next muscle that we come to as we come across the back of the forearm is ECRL, extensor carpi radialis longus. So I go brachioradialis to ECRL. The next guy I want to find is ECRB, extensor carpi radialis brevis. So as I'm coming across the back of the forearm, This is where I start, and this is how I proceed. Brachioradialis, ECRL, ECRB, extensor digitorum. All right, now oftentimes the extensor digitorum will identify the extensor indicis, that goes to the index finger, and also the extensor digiti minimi, that goes to the little finger. So all of those are part of the extensor digitorum collection. They all go to the fingers. Next, as we come across extensor carpi ulnaris, and then if we come to the medial most aspect of the posterior forearm, we encounter a flexor because it wraps around to the front side. So the last muscle that we come to on the posterior aspect of the forearm is flexor carpi ulnaris. So let's do it again. Find the lateralmost muscle, that's brachioradialis. So go in sequence, brachioradialis, ECRL, ECRB, extensor digitorum, extensor carpi ulnaris, and then our last guy is flexor carpi ulnaris, which actually wraps around from the backside to the front side, therefore becoming a flexor muscle rather than an extensor. Three other muscles that need to be pointed out here, situated right on the olecranon process of the ulna, is the anconeus. You can see it there, situated right on the olecranon process. Also, muscles that abduct and extend the thumb can be identified here on the posterior aspect of the forearm. The top one is abductor pollicis longus, and the one below that is extensor pollicis brevis. So those tendons are going to go to the lateral aspect of the thumb to abduct it, that means to move it away from the hand, and to extend it, that means to straighten it out if it's bent. Okay, those are the superficial muscles of the posterior forearm. I've tried to offer to you the only way I know to memorize these. It's the way that I used. Perhaps it will work for you also. Most illustrations of the hand are so busy with names and labels that it becomes almost impossible to teach because there are so many muscles, there are so many tendons, so many things to point to, and so many things to label that it becomes too busy for a student to even understand what's being taught. So I was lucky to find this particular illustration, which is showing only the deeper muscles of the palmar aspect of the hand. But in order to look at these, let's go back and talk about things which are superficial to this. Look at the base of the thumb. You see two little tendons that have been cut off. Well, in the previous slide, we identified the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis brevis. Those are the tendons of those two muscles which we identified in the forearm. Also, in the previous slide showing the flexor or anterior side of the forearm, we had a muscle called the palmaris longus. The palmaris longus extends into the hand as a flat tendon. We call a flat tendon an aponeurosis. So we would have most superficial, the skin, just below the skin, the palmar aponeurosis. Also, on the flexor or anterior aspect of the forearm, we had the flexor digitorum superficialis. Those are the muscles that move the fingers. I mentioned on that slide that deep to these, we also have the flexor digitorum profundus. None of those things are shown here. So the skin is gone, the palmar aponeurosis is gone, the flexor digitorum superficialis, the flexor digitorum profundus have been taken away so that you can see the deeper muscles of the palm. So you will notice there the opponens pollicis and the opponens digiti minimi. Opposition means that you can bring the thumb and the little finger together. So that is a feature that human hands have that other animals can't do. They can't oppose. It's called having an opposable thumb. So we can oppose the little finger and the thumb, courtesy of these particular muscles that are shown here. Opponens pollicis, opponens digiti minimi. Notice then, running deep to the opponens pollicis, we have the adductor pollicis that moves the thumb toward the midline. There are many, many muscles that move the thumb. It has been said that if a person loses their thumb from a hand, the hand becomes basically worthless. So having a thumb which can move this way, that way, any way that you want is extremely valuable. When we get to the deepest layer of muscles, those are called interosseous muscles. Interosseous means between the bones. The bones of the hand are called the metacarpal bones. So these are the muscles that are between the metacarpal bones. So at its deepest layer on the palmar aspect, these are some muscles that you would want to be familiar with. Okay, not quite as busy on the extensor side or the dorsal aspect of the hand. First of all, notice the extensor retinaculum that is just below the skin. That is connective tissue. It is like a bracelet. The extensor retinaculum and the flexor retinaculum wrap around the wrist, much like a bracelet. So it's connective tissue. You know that connective tissue does not extend. It has no elasticity. So what we have there is the carpal tunnel. Notice all of the tendons that have to pass through that tunnel. There are 3 nerves that also will have to pass through there to innervate the muscles of the hands, and that can create a problem. Okay, so the basics here on the dorsal aspect of the hand. Remember, we had the abductor pollicis longus. We had the extensor pollicis brevis coming from the lower part of the forearm down to the thumb. Here we see the cut tendons of the extensor digitorum and the extensor pollicis. And you can see their tendons going there to the base of the thumb. We have the extensor digitorum. Those are the tendons from the extensor digitorum muscle, which is in the forearm. The tendons will go to the dorsal aspect of the fingers. Then we have the abductor digiti minimi. You can just reach to the outside part of your hand and you can feel that muscle. It's a pretty massive little muscle. They're just lateral to the fifth metacarpal bone. So contraction of the abductor digiti minimi will move the little finger out away from the midline. Between the metacarpal bones, as we did have on the flexor side, we also have on the extensor side. So we just call those the dorsal interosseous muscles on the dorsal aspect or the extensor aspect of the hand. True, we have not studied the nerves yet, but I don't care. I wanted you to see this. These are the areas of the shoulders and arms that are innervated by a variety of nerves. The areas shown in yellow there and indicated supraclavicular nerve, those are only sensory fibers. If we were talking about the muscle there, that would be the trapezius. The trapezius is innervated by the spinal accessory nerve. So where it says supraclavicular nerve, well, that's innervation of the skin, feeling, the sense of touch. Supraclavicular, the motor fibers to the trapezius are by way of the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 11. Also notice where it says suprascapular nerve, well, that's pointing to the area of the pectoralis major. We've already identified that the motor fibers to innervate the pectoralis major are the medial and lateral pectoral nerves. So where it says suprascapular nerve, that area of skin is innervated by the suprascapular nerve, sense of touch. Okay, notice there where you have the big deltoideus colored in pink. The axillary nerve is a branch of the brachial plexus. It contains both motor and sensory fibers. So the skin and also the musculature of the deltoideus is innervated by the axillary nerve. If something says cutaneous, that means it innervates the skin. That means it is only for sensation. It's not motor functions. Now, notice the baby blue colored area. The baby blue colored area is innervated by the radial nerve. And notice that that runs all the way down to the index finger and the middle finger. So any type of palsy of the radial nerve will cause the wrist to flop down. The person cannot lift their wrist because of a radial nerve palsy. Any compression of the radial nerve in the armpit will cause the wrist to drop like that. Again, there we have a green area called the antebrachial cutaneous nerve. Those are sensory fibers. If it says cutaneous, it means it's sensory, it's not motor. The musculocutaneous nerve is another branch of the brachial plexus. It is a mixed nerve, as the name says. Musculo is motor, cutaneous is sensory. So we have a small area of the forearm there that's innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. Now, of particular interest, notice on both sides the areas of the hand and fingers, which are innervated by the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve innervates the little finger, the pinky, and half of the ring finger. The median nerve innervates the lateral aspect of the hand, and of course the radial nerve on the dorsal aspect. So just to give you an idea of all of these muscles of the arms, the forearms, and the hands, and their innervation, just bear this in mind. Skeletal muscle doesn't contract unless it is innervated. So any type of lesion that interferes with the transmission of signals through these nerves that originate from the brachial plexus, you're going to end up with both muscular palsy, the muscles go flaccid, and you also end up with no sensation or oftentimes a prickly or numb feeling in those areas. So depending on where the area of loss of sensation occurs or the area where loss of motor control occurs, you can identify which nerve has been affected. So familiarize yourself with the innervations that are available to the arms and hands. That becomes real important later on. Good evening, Clyde, and welcome back to our study of the anatomy of the musculature. Normally, we would be doing this in lab where we have excellent models to use for your education, but since that is not possible these days, we'll do the best we can with what we have. Tonight we should be moving on and finishing up with our study of the muscles of the lower extremities. I know that most of this, or at least some of this, is busier than what I would expect you to learn, and I will try to point out those areas where there are things that, well, you should be familiar with, but as far as me testing you over them, Well, probably not. It's a little too busy for the needs of this course. Okay, let's get started. Click to go to the next slide. I think I mentioned to you somewhere along the way that it was always helpful for me to have a place to start and then to just memorize things in sequence as I go from that location across the structure. Well, I did the same with the upper leg. And so my favorite place to start is always the lateral most muscle. So that would be the tensor fascia lata. So notice the tensor fascia lata there situated on the lateral aspect of the hips. It only runs for about 6 inches, and then it becomes a very long tendon. So trace the tensor fascia lata down and notice that it becomes the iliotibial band, which is going to insert near the tibial tuberosity. The tensor fascia lata is an abductor of the leg. It moves the leg away from the midline, and it is innervated by the superior gluteal nerve. So if we have the TFL, the tensor fascia lata, to start with, let's just move toward the midline and identify the muscles that we find. Notice we have a long, flat, ribbon-shaped muscle that originates at the anterior superior iliac spine, and it comes down and crosses over the anterior thigh. That is the sartorius. Find it. It is just below the skin, so it's very superficial. You would use the sartorius to uncross your legs. So imagine that you have your legs crossed and you want to uncross them. Well, you would need to use those extensor muscles, and you would also need to use the sartorius. The sartorius is innervated by the femoral nerve. Next, as we move toward the midline, well, there's your big iliopsoas. Remember that we had the iliacus up in the hip and we had the psoas major. Well, they come together in the upper leg to form the iliopsoas. The innervation of the iliacus is the femoral nerve. The innervation of the psoas major is the anterior rami of the lumbar spinal nerves. These are flexors of the hip. So when you contract this muscle, you're going to bring the knees up toward the belly. So we call those flexors of the hip. The next muscle that you come to, going toward the midline, there is your pectineus coming off of the pubic bone, inserting on the shaft of the femur. The pectineus is an adductor. It brings the leg toward the midline. The innervation of the pectineus muscle is the femoral nerve. The next muscle we come to going toward the midline is adductor longus. We have three adductors. The adductor longus and the adductor brevis can be seen from the front. The big doo-wop daddy adductor magnus is on the back side, so we'll see it on the next slide. All three of the adductors are innervated by the obturator nerve. All right, the last muscle that we come to as we go across from the lateral aspect to the medial aspect, that is another flat ribbon-shaped muscle. It is called the gracilis. The gracilis is innervated by the femoral nerve, and it is an adductor. It pulls the leg toward the midline. Okay, so that takes care of the anterior thigh in the upper aspect. If we go down to the middle or to the lower, well, let's just start with the same muscle again. How about that tensor fascia lata? Well, by now it's the iliotibial band, so it's the same muscle. This is just the connective tissue aspect of the muscle. So start at the iliotibial band and let's go across from there. Well, we have the vastus lateralis, we have the rectus femoris, and then we have the vastus medialis. Those are 3 of the 4 quadriceps muscles. The 4th muscle of the quadriceps group lies deep to the rectus femoris, so we would have to take the rectus femoris out of the way in order to see it. That muscle is called the vastus intermedius. So the 4 quadriceps muscles come together to form the big quadriceps tendon, in which is located the patella. The quadriceps tendon will insert at the tibial tuberosity and therefore is an extensor of the lower leg. All 4 of the muscles of the quadriceps group are innervated by the femoral nerve. That brings us again to the sartorius, which we've already covered, and then the medial most muscle of the upper leg, the gracilis, which we have already covered. Next slide, please. Okay, what we have here is a view of the musculature with the sartorius taken out of the way. It's a superficial muscle. The quadriceps muscles have been taken out of the way, and also the tensor fascia lata has been taken out of the way so that we can see the muscles that are deep to them. You should recognize the iliacus and the psoas major coming together to form the iliopsoas, which makes a V-shape type of arrangement with the pectineus. We have already seen that. I told you that the adductor longus is seen from the front. There it is. You would have to look at the right side to see the adductor brevis, but it is also visible from the front. Now, the big doo-wop-a-daddy there, adductor magnus, well, it's visible from the front if you take everything else out of the way, but primarily you would see the adductor magnus from the back side. All of the adductors are innervated by the obturator nerve. The medial most muscle of all of these is the gracilis, and the gracilis is innervated by the femoral nerve. So these are just the muscles that lie deep to the quadriceps, deep to the sartorius, deep to the tensor fascia lata. Most of these you have already seen. This is perhaps a more complete view of them. Next slide, please. Well, on the posterior aspect of the upper leg, we have the flexors of the leg, also called the hamstrings. You might well recognize the big gluteus maximus there. The gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the body. It is innervated by the inferior gluteal nerve. Well, let's get back to doing things the way that I told you that I learned them. I like to start at the lateral most muscle and come across. Well, in this particular illustration, the lateral most muscle is not labeled. Well, you would know what it is, so look at the one that is lateral most. That is the tensor fascia lata. We covered that on the previous slide. Tensor fascia lata is innervated by the superior gluteal nerve, and it is an abductor of the leg. As we come across from the tensor fascia lata, our next muscle there is biceps femoris. As the name indicates, it has 2 heads. The innervation of the biceps femoris is the tibial nerve, which is a branch of the sciatic nerve. Coming toward the midline one more step, our next muscle there is semitendinosus, so named because it has a very long tendon, one of the hamstrings, and then the next muscle is the semimembranosus. So as we go from the lateral to the medial, the muscles we encounter are tensor fascia lata, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. I always remember that membranosus is medial. Tendinosus is lateral to that. Okay, so these are the hamstring muscles. They are all innervated by the tibial nerve, which is a branch of the sciatic. They're at the very midline coming off the pubic bone, extending all the way down to the tibia. That again is the gracilis, which is innervated by the femoral nerve. Next slide, please. So here we go, Clyde, moving south of the knee and looking at the muscles of the lower leg from the lateral aspect. I chose this illustration because it gives us a west to east direction to go, and I like doing it that way. So looking at this first illustration here, if I start at the west, or what I would say lateral most aspect in this particular view, notice the big gastrocnemius. That is what you would call the calf muscle. The gastrocnemius has two heads. The gastrocnemius is overlying another muscle which has the same action, that is to raise you up on your toes. The soleus. Both of these muscles are innervated by the tibial nerve. So start with gastrocnemius, next muscle, soleus. Both of these dorsiflex the foot, plantar flex. Plantar flexion means to stand up on your toes. So we have then gastrocnemius and soleus innervated by the tibial nerve. Then we have on the lateral aspect of the leg, the next muscle shown there, it's labeled peroneus longus. That is what the muscle has historically been called. In your textbook, and probably the more accepted nomenclature these days, is to call the muscle fibularis. Rather than peroneus longus, it would be called the fibularis longus. We have three of these fibularis muscles: fibularis longus, fibularis brevis, and fibularis tertius. All of them evert the foot. They turn the lateral aspect of the foot up. So that is eversion of the foot. All three of the muscles are innervated by the superficial fibular nerve. So fibularis longus, fibularis brevis, fibularis tertius, all innervated by superficial fibular nerve. All three insert on the lateral aspect of the foot. Therefore, when they contract, they evert the foot. Move to the illustration on the right to see the deeper muscles. These are right up against the tibia on the back side. So there is the fibularis brevis, which we have already talked about. Then our next muscle is extensor digitorum longus. If it's longus, that means it originates in one body part and inserts on another. So this one originates in the lower leg, but the insertion is at the toes. So that's why it's called longus. We will later have the extensor digitorum brevis. If it's brevis, that means it originates in one body part and inserts in the same body part. So in this case, we have extensor digitorum longus, which originates in the lower leg and inserts at the toes. The innervation of the extensor digitorum longus is the deep fibular nerve. Lying right up against the posterior aspect of the tibia, the muscle is the tibialis posterior. It has what is it? Plantar flexion aspect, plantar flexion action, raising the person up on the toes. The innervation of tibialis posterior is the tibial nerve. Okay, so just memorize them from left to right as they appear in sequence and associate the name of the nerve with the body part, and you should be okay. It gets extremely busy after this, so watch out. In the back of the knee, we call that area of the body the popliteal fossa. It isn't shown here and it isn't labeled, but right in the popliteal fossa, we have a muscle called the popliteus. They may be trying to show it there just above the gastrocnemius. That's where it would be. They don't really have the muscle shown or a label given to it, but there is a muscle there in the popliteal fossa that's called the popliteus, and it is innervated by the tibial nerve. So notice here that the gastrocnemius has been cut off and taken out of the way so that you can see the underlying soleus, which we've already talked about, but also what you see here is a very long tendon that runs from the popliteal fossa all the way to the plantar surface of the foot. So the muscle is called the plantaris, and it also has the same action as the gastrocnemius and soleus, and that is plantar flexion of the foot, otherwise standing up on your toes. Innervation, tibial nerve. Okay, if we follow the pattern that we have been following, going from a starting point and just progressing sequentially from there, starting at the extreme left side, the first muscle that you would come to there, it doesn't have a line or a label. You should recognize that as the gastrocnemius and the soleus. They come together to form the calcaneal tendon, which is labeled here Achilles tendon. So start there and let's just advance forward. We would then have the three fibularis muscles. In this illustration, they're called peroneus. I told you that peroneus is the old-fashioned term. Fibularis is what's currently used for these muscles. So we would have the fibularis longus, the fibularis brevis, and the fibularis tertius. All three of those evert the foot. They turn the lateral aspect of the foot up. All three of those are innervated by the superficial fibular nerve. Moving toward the front or from left to right, our next muscle there is extensor digitorum longus. The extensor digitorum longus is innervated by the deep fibular nerve. It originates in the lower leg, but it inserts on the toes. That's why it's called longus. So contraction of the extensor digitorum longus would raise the toes. The next muscle we come to there, extensor hallucis longus, also innervated by the deep fibular nerve. That goes to the big toe. Hallucis is the word for big toe. Since it originates in the lower leg, but it inserts on the toe, then we call it longus. The last muscle that you come to there is the tibialis anterior. The tibialis anterior is innervated by the deep fibular nerve. It inserts on the metatarsal bones of the foot. So when you contract the tibialis anterior, you raise the foot or extend the foot. Shin splints. When the tibialis anterior muscle hurts, you have shin splints. If you haven't run in a while and you go out and run, well, in order to run, you have to raise the foot up with each step. Otherwise, you're going to trip over your own toes. So that repeated action of raising the foot requires the tibialis anterior to work and work and work and work to the point of fatigue. So you're going to end up being sore the next day. Tibialis anterior, innervated by deep fibular nerve, action to extend the foot. If we start at the skin on the sole of the foot and then just go deep from there, it turns out to be 4 different layers of muscle. And it, like the palm of the hand was, is incredibly busy. So there are so many things, so many muscles running in so many directions, it becomes almost impossible to teach and therefore impossible to learn. So I wanted to simplify it. So if you take off the skin of the sole of the foot, the first thing you come to is this plantar aponeurosis. This is connective tissue. It is a pad to cushion and to protect the underlying structures of the bottom of the foot. If the plantar aponeurosis is strained and inflamed, then a person is said to have plantar fasciitis. Okay, so I just wanted you to see that this is where we would start. The first thing we come to when we take the skin off is the plantar aponeurosis. In the next views, we will have the plantar aponeurosis out of the way so that we can see muscles of the second and third and even the fourth level. Well, here at the second and third levels of muscles of the plantar aspect of the foot, what we have done is taken the plantar aponeurosis out of the way. Notice there at the bottom of the illustration, the plantar aponeurosis has been cut away. That exposes the second level. So the illustration on the left, these are the muscles of the second level. The one that you see there that is most obvious is flexor digitorum brevis. The one going to the big toe, that is flexor hallucis longus, originating in the lower leg, but extending all the way to the big toe. Also, we have at this level the abductor hallucis. So right here at the second level go flexor digitorum brevis, abductor hallucis, and flexor hallucis longus. Flexion of the toes means you bend them down. All of these are innervated by the medial and lateral plantar nerves. In the illustration on the right, what we have done is we have taken away the flexor digitorum brevis, which exposes the flexor digitorum longus tendons. Remember, we only see the tendons because the muscle is actually in the lower leg. So it is longus because the muscle is in the lower leg, but it inserts on the toes. So once we have the flexor digitorum brevis out of the way, then that exposes the third level, which would include the flexor digitorum longus. Also, notice just deep to that, the quadratus plantae. That will be considered part of the next level, but you can certainly see it here just deep to the flexor digitorum longus. Flexor digitorum longus also is innervated by the medial plantar nerve.